questions. It says, when they had eaten their meal, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said, "you know that I love you." At which Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." A second time he put his question, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" "Yes, Lord," Peter said, "you know that I love you." Jesus replied, "Tend my sheep." A third time Jesus asked him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because he had asked the third time, "Do you love me?" So he said to him, "Lord, you know everything. You know well that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep." So a couple things here. The words that Jesus uses here for love, in Greek there's 4 different words for love. So Jesus starts by asking Peter, do you agape me? Do you love me sacrificially? Are you willing to lay down your life for me? And Peter says, "Yes, Lord, I phileo you. I love you. I love you like a brother." And then the second time Jesus asks him again, says, "Peter, do you agape me? Do you love me sacrificially?" And Peter again says, "I love you like a brother." And so the third time Jesus kind of lowers the bar and he says, "Peter, do you love me like a brother?" And he says, "Yes, Lord, you know that I do." And so a couple things. One is that Jesus meets him where he's at. He's asking all of us for agape love, which is laying down our lives for another. But he knows also when we're not ready for that, he meets us where we're at and then eventually calls us higher. And of course we know that Peter eventually did give his life for Jesus, being crucified upside down. The other thing though is with the charcoal fire. I remember, many of you know this story, my mom died of cancer at the age of 57. She was actually improving with the chemotherapy, and one night we were watching a ball game. She had an internal hemorrhage. She started bleeding, and my dad called 911. I was doing CPR on my mom, and she died in my arms within minutes. So I'm 56. Now I realize how young my mother was. I'll be 57 in December. And so I was in seminary. I was angry with God. I was ready to leave the whole thing because I thought, God, you took away the most important person in my life. And so I almost left the seminary, but fortunately I had a really good spiritual director. And he said, "Burke, you have to go back to that night." And he called it my charcoal fire. So remember when there's 2 charcoal fires in Scripture. Where's the first one? It's outside the Praetorium where Peter denies Christ. So we're going to have a chance to be at that location when we get to Jerusalem. And so imagine Jesus building a charcoal fire here. And when Peter sees the charcoal fire, what's he going to think? That's where I denied you. That was his wound, right? And so Jesus brings Peter back to his charcoal fire, to his wound, not to condemn him, not to shame him, but to heal him. So he denied him 3 times. And here he gives him a chance for reconciliation, forgiveness 3 times. So my spiritual director said, I need to go back to my charcoal fire, my wound, which was my mother's dying in my arms. And I said, I don't want to go back to that night. I'm trying to forget it. And he said, you can stuff it away, and maybe you can relate to this in some wounds that you have in your life. You can bury it, but it's going to come out in unconstructive ways in the future. So he said, you can go there, but you're not going to be alone. So I want you to invite Jesus into that scene. So I thought he was crazy, but I trusted him. So I went into a chapel one night, and I started recalling the night of my mother's death, and all of the anxieties and fears and all those things rose up again. But as my spiritual director said, he says, I want you to ask Jesus, where were you? Because what happens is the enemy wants to teach us lies. He wants us to believe lies about God and about ourselves. And the lie that I believed was that God had abandoned us in our most important time. And so we get to I go back into that moment, and the last thing my mother said to me was, I can't breathe, and she collapses into my arms. And so what happened was I said, Jesus, where were you? Because I believe that you abandoned me. And what he showed me was, you know the Pietà, where Jesus is holding his mother's body? It was like the reverse. I was holding my mother's body, and then Jesus was wrapped around both of us. And I just started to bawl in the chapel. But what happened was the healing started to take place. I needed to go back to that charcoal fire and believe the truth that Jesus never abandoned us, that he was right there with us in that sadness. And I know something changed in my heart that night, because it was about a year, I couldn't even think of my mother without crying. And now I can talk about this because I believe she's with God, and God never abandoned us, that she's with him. And so I just want to share that story with you, because we all have our charcoal fires. We all have those wounds in our past that we might want to stuff into a room. We want to shut the door and make sure nobody gets in that room. But it's going to come out in unconstructive ways. And so I want to encourage us, when we have time of silence, it might not even be during this trip, but to go back to your charcoal fire and ask Jesus, where were you? And let him, renounce those lies that we believe, to know the truth that he's with us. This is something that I'm going to be working with, the Richards family on, who just lost their son. And interestingly, she literally had him in her arms that last day. And I know the enemy is going to be right there saying, see, God abandoned you. But I know the truth is that God was in there with them, weeping with them. The Lord, Jesus wept at the death of his friend Lazarus. God has a heart, and he desires the best for us, but he also knows that we suffer, we go through difficult times. And so this place is a very special place to me, because it's a reminder of God always being with us every step of the way, never abandoning us. So with that, going back to our guides.